The Louis XV Palace, de Versailles. Louis XIV died in 1714, and the new king, Louis XV, just 4 years old, and his government were moved temporarily from Versailles to Paris under the regency of Philippe, the second Duke of Orleans. In 1722, when the king became of age, he moved his residence back and the government to Versailles, where it remained until the French Revolution of 1789. Louis XV remained faithful to the original plan of his grandfather's hunting lodge and made few changes to the exterior of Versailles. His main construction of salons of Hercules, which connected the main building of the palace with the north wing and the chapel. This was between 1742 and 1736. And the Royal Opera Theatre, designed by André Jacques Gabriel and built between 1769 and 1770. The new theatre was completed in time for the celebration of the wedding of the Dauphin, the future Louis XVI, and Marie Antoinette, the Archduchess of Austria. He also made numerous additions and changes to the royal apartments, where he, the Queen, his daughters, and their heirs lived. In 1738, Louis XV remodeled the King's Petite apartment on the north side of the Cour de Marbre, originally the entrance court of the old Chateau. He discreetly provided accommodations in another palace for his famous mistresses, Madame de Pompadour, and later, when she fell out of his favor, Madame du Barry. The extension of the king's petite apartment necessitated the demolition of the ambassador's staircase, one of the most admired features of Louis XIV's regime, which left the palace without a grand staircase entrance. Louis XVI and the palace during the Revolution. Louis XVI was constrained by the worsening financial situation of the kingdom from making major changes to the palace. So he primarily focused on improvements to the royal apartments. Louis XVI gave Marie Antoinette the Petit Trianon in 1774. The Queen made extensive changes to the interior and added a theatre, the Theatre de la Reine. She also totally transformed the Arboretum planted during the reign of Louis XV in what would become known as the Hammam de la Reine, which was the picturesque collection of buildings modeled after a royal French hamlet, where the Queen and other courtiers could play at being peasants for the day. They would literally go back into the countryside when they were in this small hamlet that was recreated. The Queen was at the Petit Trianon in 1789 when she first learned of the beginning of the French Revolution in July in 1789. The palace was the site of the signings of 3 treaties of the Peace of Paris, 1783, to which the United Kingdom recognized the independence of the United States of America. The palace and its surroundings was the scene of some of the most dramatic moments of the early French Revolution. In the spring of 1789, the king summoned the Estates General of 1789, representatives of the nobility, clergy, and other ordinary citizens to Versailles to persuade them to support the royal finances. The palace did not have any large rooms enough for this meeting, so it was held in the Menu Plaisir du Roi, a large royal depot in the town close to the palace, in the town of Versailles. When the meeting began on May 9, 1789, disputes immediately arose between the royal government, the nobility, and the clergy, and the delegates of the Third Estate, who represented the middle class. Louis XVI, against the advice of his Minister of Finance, decided to lock out the Third Estate members, so the middle class was locked out of the meeting. The Third Estate members met instead in an enclosed tennis court, where they declared themselves a national assembly and took an oath to form a democratic government where all citizens were equal in France. The King and Queen learned of the storming of the Bastille in Paris on July 14, 1789, while they were at the palace, and remained isolated there while the French Revolution in Paris spread. The growing anger in Paris led to the Women's March on Versailles on October 5th, 1789. A crowd of several thousand men and women protesting the high price and scarcity of bread marched from the markets of Paris to Versailles. They took weapons from the city armory, besieged the palace, and compelled the king and queen and royal family and the members of the National Assembly to return with them to Paris the following day. As soon as the royal family departed, the palace was closed to await their return. In 1742, the convention of the new revolutionary government ordered the transfer of all paintings and sculptures from the palace to the Louvre. In 1783, the convention declared the abolition of the monarchy and ordered all royal property in the palace to be sold at auction. The auction took place on August 25th, 1783, and on August 11th, 1794. The furnishings and art of the palace, including the furniture, mirrors, baths, and kitchens, and equipment, were sold in 17,000 lots. All fleur-de-lis and royal emblems on the buildings were chamfered or chiseled off. The empty buildings were turned into storehouses and furnishings for art, and the libraries were confiscated from the nobility and dispersed. The empty grand apartments were opened for tours beginning in 1793, with a small museum and an art school created for some of the empty rooms. Let's talk about 19th century Versailles. In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte became the Emperor of France. He considered making Versailles his residence, but abandoned the idea due to the cost of the renovation. Prior to his marriage to Marie-Louise in 1810, he had the Grand Trianon restored and refurbished as a springtime residence for himself and his family, in the style as we can see it today. In 1850, with the final downfall of Napoleon, Louis XII, the younger brother of Louis XI, became king and considered returning the royal residence to Versailles, where he had been born. He ordered the restoration of the royal apartments, but the task and cost was too great. Neither he nor his successor, Charles X, lived at Versailles. The French Revolution in 1830 brought a new monarch, Louis Philippe, to power and a new ambition for Versailles. He did not reside at Versailles, but began the creation of the Museum of the History of France, dedicated to all the glories of France, located in the south wing of the palace, which had been used to house some members of the royal family at one time. The museum began in 1833 and inaugurated on June 30th, 1837. The most famous room is the Galerie de Bastille, the Hall of Battles, which lies on most of the length of the second floor. Louis Philippe had the far end of the south wing of the Cour Royale demolished and rebuilt to match the Gabrielle wing of 1780, which gave greater uniformity of appearance to the front entrance. The museum project largely came to a halt when Louis Philippe was overthrown in 1848. Emperor Napoleon III used the palace on occasion as a stage for grand ceremonies. One of the most lavish was for the banquet that he hosted for Queen Victoria in the Royal Opera in 1855. During the Franco-German War of 1870 to 1871, the palace was occupied by the general staff of the victorious German army. Parts of the chateau, including the Gallery of Mirrors, were turned into a military hospital. The creation of the German Empire combined with Prussia and the surrounding German states under William I. So let's briefly touch on the 20th century. The 20th century saw the beginning of restoration efforts at the palace, first led by Pierre de Nolec, poet and scholar, and the first conservator of the Chateau de Versailles. He began his work in 1892. The conservation and restoration was interrupted by 2 world wars, but has continued till the present day. The palace briefly returned to the world stage in June of 1919, when the Treaty of Versailles formally ended the First World War. It was signed in the Hall of Mirrors Between 1725 and 1728, the American philanthropist and multi-billionaire John D. Rockefeller gave $2,166,000 for the restoration, the equivalent of about $30 million today, to aid the refurbishing of the palace's furnishings. In addition, 18th century weaving techniques were revived at Versailles in an aid to bring back window treatments and bed hangings. The two greatest achievements of this initiative are seen today in wall hangings and bed dress. Additionally, this project, which took over 7 years to achieve, required over 700 kilograms of silver and gold for thread alone. One of the more costly endeavors of the museum and France has been to repurchase much of the furniture accessories as possible. However, because furniture with a royal provenance, and especially that was made for Versailles, is a highly sought after commodity on the international market, so it becomes very difficult. The 21st century. In 2003, a new restoration initiative, the Grand Versailles Project, was started, which began with the replantation of the gardens, which lost over 10,000 trees to Hurricane Lothar in December of 1999. One part of the initiative was the restoration of the Hall of Mirrors, which was completed in 2006, and the Royal Opera, which was completed in 2009. I just want to make another note about John Rockefeller also, because anybody who's local know that Rockefeller did a study 2 years later after he donated this money to Versailles, which was to do a study on Salem, New Jersey, to possibly make that into the next Williamsburg. But that study thwarted the opportunity because of the possibility of a walking, breathing museum with two live roads coming through, that people may get injured. So that was thwarted, and then it proceeded. Rockefeller went to Williamsburg to create a colonial lifestyle museum.